Well, we have worked our way to Colossians chapter 4, and this is the fifth week that we've spent on Colossians. We've talked about how so much of it is a call to go further up and further in, the great phrase from C.S. Lewis in his Chronicles of Narnia. Further up and further in, into God's heart, into knowing God, and into also the depth of the Christian life. And so as we come toward the end of the letter, we're going to read, we've been looking at larger sections, larger passages, and this week it's just a few verses. I invite you to follow along. Again, we've provided notes, a spot for notes and a spot for you to follow along in your bulletin if you want to. Listen to these words from the book that we love. Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. And pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. What I want you to do is I want us to start off, and I want you to share with somebody next to you. All the introverts in the room just had a heart attack. It's okay. You'll be safe. Just share with the person next to you who you think in your life that you know, who is a great conversationalist, someone you really enjoy talking with. And you don't have to just say, your best friend or your spouse, okay? You get a free pass on that. You can pick that person who has a particular gift of making a conversation delightful. Turn to the person next to you, tell them who it is and why. And just real quick, we'll just take a minute to do this. All right, just take a couple more seconds. All right, if we could have a sampling, we're not going to do this, but if we could take a sampling, this is what I would imagine you all shared. That you shared people that you're close to or that you admire, and there are a few traits or a few different categories that you probably shared. Some of you probably thought of someone in your life who just is really good at taking an incredible interest in you or in whoever they're talking with, right? They are laser focused on you, good at listening, good at empathy, and having that great humility that all great listeners have. Or it may have been somebody who is able to speak on any sort of topic and is just kind of has a great curiosity to their lives. And so that makes them somebody that you can engage with, and you know that no matter what you're talking about and whatever you're talking, it's going to be interesting and a lot of fun because they're going to be engaged in no matter what the topic is. Or it may have been somebody who is just a great storyteller, either because they're just really funny or fun to be around, or they make things delightful. They're passionate, or they're even mischievous in the way that they speak or fun at teasing people. I want us to focus on verses 5 and 6 today, just to look at those. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer every one. Be wise in the way we act toward outsiders. That, I think, there's several questions we could ask that this text asks us. But one question it certainly asks is, how is a Christian supposed to or is called to act toward people outside their community? And it's interesting that Paul chooses then to talk about the way that we act in terms of conversation, always full of grace, seasoned with salt. And Paul would be concerned about this, and he obviously had vast experience in dealing with outsiders. He made that the calling and the mission of his life, to go and to preach, to set up churches, to talk to people, some of which his talking, and some of those people which would land him in jail. And he mentions that here, right? He reminds us that. The mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. And so he, more than almost anybody, would know what it meant to deal and to act with outsiders. So what we want to do is answer that question, because I think this passage answers it, but it's kind of in it's a very subtle ways that we might not have caught on the very first reading through. How does a Christian act with people outside their community? And there are three ways I think this passage answers that question. First, it has to do with how we view ourselves. It has to do with how you view the world and how you view the story, the gospel. How you view yourself, how you view the world, and how you view the story itself. How you view yourself. Now, that might not be the first place we immediately go to when we think of how do you act with outsiders. Well, the first thing you do is you ask who you are, who you want to be, who you are becoming in Christ. And there's one little word that kind of keys us into this. Well, first of all, there's the whole other 3 chapters of Colossians that we've read through, where Paul is challenging the Colossians and telling them, you have great faith, but there's even deeper to go. There's even more to explore. There's this endless riches in Christ that you can explore and to go deeper in. But there's also this word in here where he says, let your conversation be always full of grace. Always. This is a habit. This is what he was describing. This is the outworking of what he was describing earlier when he said to clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, gentleness, patience. In that case, he was talking about how do we relate to the church, to other Christians, to people within our own communities. And now he's saying, turn that attitude outward. Let your conversation always be full of grace. In other words, be that person who is clothed with those things. So this isn't just about how to talk to people who aren't Christians. This actually makes an assumption about who you might be as a Christian. Paul assumes that the Christian is going to be a person who is gentle, who is a listener, who is capable of being wise, of being courteous, gracious, and even delightful in their speech. And we'll talk about that later. And that's how you know how to answer each person. Did you catch that? He says how to answer everyone. But actually a better translation is each one. That doesn't seem like much of a difference. But I think it's important because so often we think about how Christians talk to and speak and share their story and their faith with people that are outside the Christian community, outside the Christian faith. It's often thinking of how do we have the right answers? How do we know enough? How do we say the right words? But here, how do we have the right script, in other words? But here it says, how do you answer each one, each individual person? Not how do you have the right script so that anything you say to anybody will prove true, but no, how do you answer sensitively, thoughtfully, lovingly? That one individual person who's in front of you in that one moment. How do we do that? There is a way to know, and did you catch that too? Because this is the part of this passage that I love so much. How do you, bless you. That was epic. One of the things that strikes me is so amazing in this is, let your conversation be always full of grace so that you may know how to answer each one. Think about that. How do you know how to answer each one? How do you know how to answer somebody when they have questions about life and about faith and about the hope that you have within you? Well, naturally, what we think is that the way to go about that is to study a little bit more, to become a little bit smarter, to be maybe a little more bold or aggressive, or to be the most righteous, or to have the most answers, or to know the most. And what Paul says here is the way that you know how to answer each one is by being full of grace. That wouldn't even make my top 10 list, I don't think. It's a challenge. It's a challenge for you and for me and for so many Christians. How do you know how to answer each one? Is by being in yourself, by clothing yourself with grace, with compassion, with kindness, with those things of the Spirit that make a Christian a Christian. Not having the right answer to everything, not knowing everything, not having the right prepared speech or remarks, but to be a kind and loving and gracious and delightful person. That's how you know how to answer each and every one. Your character, your wisdom, your actions, they are a message to those people you interact with. Maybe the picture. And so first and foremost, when we think about how do we relate, how do we speak to outsiders, how is a Christian supposed to do that? Our first response should not be to think of exactly what we say. Is to think of who we are called to be and to let that message speak loudly and clearly. But it also has to do with how you view the world in general. There's that word, gracious. Let your conversation be full of grace. Let it be gracious. And now when I hear this phrase, I generally think of being gentle, patient, kind, those words that we've been saying and that we've heard in Colossians. But there's also another aspect to this word in the Greek language. It has to do with also just being delightful, being enjoyable, attracting other people to it. And that's a beautiful sense of this word, gracious and winsome, witty, attractive, delightful. How do you view the world? Are you a person that can give those sorts of words can be attributed to? How you view the world. The other assumption that Paul is making, Paul assumes that the first and foremost, a Christian is going to clothe themselves with these things and that the world is going to notice. But also he assumes that these Christians in Colossae are going to have contact with the world around them. They're going to be moving in and out of different circles of people and speaking with outsiders. And that they would have lots to talk about, conversations to speak with their neighbors, with their friends, with their family who are not part of the Christian faith. And that they will be wise and discerning in the world. There's an easy mistake that we can make from this phrase, because when we hear that we should be wise in dealing with the world, it sometimes, I think, brings up these images of being cunning. A lot of times we've been told, and we talked about this a few months ago, we had a series about how we interact with the world. And we talked about how one of the assumptions a lot of churches have made, and I think it's wrong, is that we're to be against the world all the time. That Christians always have to have this defensive posture toward others and toward the things of the world. The world, in other words, is against us, so be smart and trust no one. That's the message we hear sometimes. But when Paul is talking about be wise, he attaches it to that beautiful phrase, make the most of every opportunity. He's not saying be wise in order to not be deceived or to be on your guard. That phrase is used other places in Scripture, but here, that's not what he's talking about. Be wise so that you don't pass up those opportunities that are right in front of you in the everyday, in those conversations that you could be pouring a little salt onto, flavoring a little bit. There are too many of us, let me put this a different way. There are too many Christians throughout history and now, and maybe you're one of them, who just don't love people enough. And what I mean by love in that sense is the way that we use the word love, we use it in a lot of different ways. What I mean is simply liking people, enjoying them, delighting in them, even when they are totally, and maybe especially when they are totally different from us. Love people. It sounds so cliche, and yet how are we supposed to be wise and discerning, be gracious, and have our conversation be seasoned with salt if we don't first just simply acknowledge the beauty and the image of God in the people that we are interacting with? It comes down to a pretty simple problem that Christians have faced since the very beginning, that all religious people and all human beings have faced, to find the good in others, to delight in the other person. Paul said it best when he said it so beautifully in 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship so that I may boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. If you're going to do this, if you're going to be that type of person whose conversation is full of grace and seasoned with salt, you probably have to love and like the people you're talking with first. Which means you have to listen. You have to see Christ in the world and in them, Christ working his glorious plan out in the world. Christ, to whom and through whom and for whom all things were created. The person that I know of who maybe lived this out the best, who was a delight to the people around him and who genuinely seemed to love the world around him, even as he critiqued it, was the author G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton was hugely influential to C.S. Lewis, and so Chesterton lived in the early 1900s. He was a man, and he did a lot of public debates. He wrote a ton of different kinds of books and articles and novels and essays, and he did a ton of different stuff. And one of the things he's most known for, and that he was known for at the time, were these public debates that he would do. And people delighted in them. People delighted in a debate. Do you ever watch a debate or listen to a debate and delight in it? Yeah. Now that we're entering political season, right? You know what I'm talking about. Chesterton loved people. And Philip Yancey, the great author, he writes an introduction to one of Chesterton's books, and he's describing G.K. Chesterton. And he writes this. Philip Yancey's writing, and he says, Chesterton cheerfully engaged in public debates with agnostics and skeptics of the day. Chesterton was a Christian. Most notably, the playwright George Bernard Shaw. Chesterton usually arrived late. He was sort of an absent-minded professor. He peered through his monocle. Isn't that great? He's a British guy with a monocle. And he would peer through his monocle at his disorderly scraps of paper and proceeded to entertain the crowd, making nervous gestures, fumbling through his pockets, and laughing heartily in a falsetto voice at his own jokes. Typically, he would charm the... That's not written in there. Typically, he would charm the audience over to his side and then celebrate by hosting his beaten opponent at the nearest pub. One of his opponents, and remember, one of his opponents wrote about his experience debating Chesterton, and he wrote this: to hear Chesterton's howl of joy, to see him double himself up in laughter at my personal insults, to watch the effect of his sportsmanship on a shocked audience who were won to mirth and joy by his joy, was a sight and sound for the gods. And I carried away from that room a respect and admiration for him. He was a sort of philosophical Peter Pan, a kindly and gallant cherub, a profound student and a wise master, and my respect has grown steadily ever since. His debating was wild, gigantic, amazing, deadly, delicious. In your conversation with outsiders, and let me say this again. This was written by one of his opponents that he disagreed with, that he argued with, that he beat in debate. How will you be remembered? By the people you argue with, by the people you are in deep conversation with. Do you actually love the people you're interacting with? Do you love them enough to delight them, even as you disagree with them? Do you love the story enough to delight them? It's not only about how you view yourself, how you clothe yourself with kindness and compassion and grace. It's not only about how you view the world and how you try to love other people. It's also just how you view the story itself. This beautiful story of God's love in the world. This beautiful story that Paul has been laying out throughout the book of Colossians. I love the phrase, full of grace, seasoned with salt. Now this phrase, it can refer to gentle, good listening. It can refer to wisdom, having wisdom in our conversations. But mostly it refers, especially the salt part, being seasoned with salt, is being delightful, full of flavor. In other words, the way you talk about the world, with the world, the way you interact with other people, there should be, if you're a Christian, there should be a certain smell with you. A delicious flavor that draws other people in. In other words, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth. You're the cilantro that's being cut up fresh to put into someone's homemade salsa. You are supposed to be the smell of curry cooking in the afternoon. You are the jasmine in the rice. You are the sweet and tangy barbecue that's been cooking all day long and is falling off the bone. You are the salt of the earth. Christians are supposed to be telling a story with their lives, in other words, that is irresistibly attractive. Because that's part of what a Christian believes. That this story of how God has come to us, has loved us, has embraced us in Jesus Christ, every part of that story from the very first as he created in the beautiful poetry of Genesis 1, as he made the world and brought it to life and breathed life into humans, to the very end when all of humanity is restored. And there are rivers flowing through the city of God, and the trees of life are for the healing of the nations, and they bear fruit 12 times a year. Every part of that story is a delight, is salty and sweet. For us, the story and what we're telling, what we're embodying, what we're clothing ourselves with as Christians is not just another story, a list of rules, a tradition, or another book. It's not just another religion to study. It's everything. It's a never-ending pursuit of the God who spent everything he had, the blood of his own Son, to pursue you. And it ends with the greatest hope the world has ever heard, further up and further in. That's what we've been talking about and where that phrase comes from. I've read it before. Let's hear it again. The words of C.S. Lewis from the end of his Chronicles of Narnia. The new Narnia was a deeper country. Every rock and flower and blade of grass looked as if it meant more. I can't describe it any better than that. If you ever get there, you will know what I mean. And one of them cried, "I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I have been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now. The reason why we loved the old world is that it sometimes looked a little like this. Come further up. Come further in." There are lots of ways you can try to live out the gospel, and there are lots of ways you can try to tell the story. Please, tell it with delight and with joy and with passion. Season it with salt. Be that person that other people love to be around because you have such an interesting view on life. In other words, don't be the potatoes of the meal. We all love potatoes. My friend in college once tried to eat a potato raw just to see what, like you would an apple. It didn't feel good. It didn't taste good, and it didn't feel good once it got down. Be the salt. Be the flavor on the meal. Standing on a street corner on a soapbox shouting at somebody. That's the potatoes of the meal. You are called to something more, further up and further in. To be the salt and the light in everyday conversation. That when the world hears what you're saying and the way that you live, they say, what is cooking for dinner? Why do you have this particular hope in your life? Why do you live in that neighborhood? Why do you have such an intriguing view of the world's news? Why do you have this holy curiosity about all things? Why do you laugh so easily? Are you so quick to listen to someone else's pain or to give a hug or to offer prayer? Why do you have such a delight, and why are you always shedding tears when you talk about things like woe, or when you listen to music, or when you go out in nature or watch a sunset? Your enthusiasm, that is the flavor that the world needs to experience and to taste. And suddenly, they're not hearing the story then. They're not hearing the question from a street corner. They're hearing it from you, around a dinner table, at a bar, around a campfire, on the front porch. Make the most of every opportunity, Paul says. Take those moments and dash a little salt on them. Every chance you get. I want to help you remember this, because this is something I'm so passionate about. And so I want to invite people to come forward if you're going to pass out what we've got for you. What I've got for you are pixie sticks. I know, not exactly what you think of when you think of the flavor of the world. But pixie sticks have that great quality that you might remember from your childhood, that when you pour it on your tongue, there's a little spark that goes off in your brain, right? When it hits that sweet. And don't ask how, it's probably some weird chemical, right? But somehow it does it. And it sparks that on your tongue. And I want you to remember that feeling. I want you to think about that. When you think about telling the gospel story, when you think about sharing your faith, don't think about reciting the 4 spiritual laws, or don't think about somebody shouting on a street corner. Think about telling the story in such a way that it's going to spark in somebody's mind like that it's going to move their heart. Because so many of you I know are sitting out there thinking, okay, I get it, but I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to make this story or my life full of flavor. And I want to say, yes, you do. You do now. Around the campfire, at the front porch, because it's about how you view yourself. So go out and grow. Find that thing you need to grow in: patience, gentleness, compassion, and clothe yourself with it. Work on the fruit of the Spirit. Prepare yourself for these conversations. And it's about how you view others. So love your neighbor well and deeply. Take an interest in them. Listen to them. Serve them. So go ahead, even right now, if you want, put a little sugar on your tongue. That's the story. That's the spark that comes. That's the tingle of the gospel that it should bring in you. That's the laughter that G.K. Chesterton would bring. Even when he was in a formal debate, he made people laugh. And they remembered that probably a lot more than his intellectual arguments. He loved them well. And so you say, but I'm not an eloquent storyteller. I'm not one of those people that anybody mentioned in the beginning of this. But remember this. Even so, you may not be the greatest storyteller, but you have the greatest story to tell. And if you love the story, it'll show. And it'll show beautifully in the world and to outsiders. What story? We've been listening to it these last 5 weeks. We've been mentioning it. We've been hearing it over and over again. So as you feel that sugar, that spark on your tongue, remember the story. Paul put it into incredible poetry for you. Do you taste it? Listen. Listen one last time to the beautiful story.
Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him
all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers.
All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before
all things, and in him
all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in
all things. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself
all things, whether on heaven or in earth.
by making peace through the blood of his cross.
Come further up. Come further in. Let us worship.